It's my pleasure to talk today to Thomas Stocker. Thomas, following your keynote, I have a couple of questions for you. It must be a heaven for an experimental climate physicist at the moment. We do not see any contrails. We have substantial changes in the albedo feedback and many adverse effects for CO2 uptake and temperature everywhere. This is going along with opportunities to validate short-term effects in large-scale models. Despite all the consequences we have to bear due to the corona outbreak, isn't it a unique opportunity for climate scientists to work nowadays?
Well, thank you, Michi. First of all, corona is a huge challenge and a great tragedy for humankind. But you are right, it is a big sensitivity experiment for the climate system. In the years before, we never had the situation that we had more than 90% of air traffic on the ground. And this is a special situation that shows us the atmosphere and the environment in an almost uncontaminated way, something that people are no longer used to. Take China, take India. People have a large range of visibility. It's a very interesting experience what nature and environment could be.
And how do you feel personally at this very moment?
Personally, it's a big challenge because we have to adapt new strategies in our research. It's not such that we have all the infrastructure available to carry out our research. Take, for example, the polar expeditions in which we are involved. The Greenland field season this summer had to be cancelled because of corona, and that means one entire year of no field experiment on the Greenland ice sheet. There are many other examples, down to the students who have challenges finishing their theses, their PhDs, defending, etc. All things that we need to consider.
Let's dive into the topic of your keynote. You have chosen for a very provocative title. Have science and education failed properly putting climate change on the agenda? You are yourselves what we would call an end-career professional in climate science. Why did it take so long for you to move from your physics of the climate system specialization to a more translational and inclusive climate agenda?
Well, this is a very good question. Thank you very much. Yes, indeed, it took quite a long time if you look from today's perspective. But you also have to appreciate to learn the ropes of how to communicate climate science to policymakers. That requires a little bit of time and experience. So that is due to the way how we work. And at the same time, I'm of the firm conviction that only scientists who are active still in their field are credible messengers and ambassadors for the science results to the public and to policymakers.
We will come back later to discuss specialization versus translational or interdisciplinarity in education. Do you expect currently a bandwagon effect from the recent lockdown because of the coronavirus for climate change?
I think what Corona has told us is that there is a large potential of solidarity in society. If you look at new ideas that have been promoted during this crisis, it's incredible what people came up with as new business models to take into account these new circumstances. So this is a message of hope that for the much bigger problem and much more long-term problem of confronting the climate crisis, there is a potential here of solidarity, of goal-oriented action, and I think that is what we need to mobilize.
So how do we mobilize this solidarity? Obviously, we need a pandemic to really move something. Why weren't we successful for the climate change agenda?
Well, climate change for many years has manifested itself only occasionally in damaging events. In the last 10 to 15 years, however, extreme events have become large points in society, break points, so to say, where people have realized that their livelihood is at stake because of climate change. And I think it's these events, together with the recognition that our resources also ultimately depend on a stable climate. For example, if you take agricultural production or the harvesting of food from the oceans, this all depends on a stable climate, and that stable climate now is visibly disturbed and disrupted.
Coming back to the solidarity, following the Paris Accord, we experienced as observers a strong segregation of the climate movement. The importance of national climate politics has emerged stronger than ever, weakening the intergovernmental approaches, which means we put more focus on national interests than global or worldwide effects. On the other hand, we talk about the Greta effect, which is particularly non-national, with strong educational messages. Greta and her followers were all well educated, weren't they? So where does it lead finally?
I think the national element is a foundational principle of the Paris Agreement. Every country had to declare their national contribution to emissions reductions. So it is clear that the nations must declare what their contribution is to confront the climate challenge. The Greta effect and the youth movement that has evolved in the last 2 years is a surprising new development that I think is extremely powerful because it comes from the bottom up and it brings the message into every family. I'm sure at your family table you also had engaged in discussions with your children about climate change, mobilized through the movement of the Fridays for Future. What the scientists have done is to give the basis, the scientific blessing, if you wish, of the messages, of the basic messages to the Fridays for Future movement. If you look at their unique motto, it says, listen to the science. The science is there to be implemented.
So you are a role model, Thomas, because you are a scientist. You studied a hardcore physics before moving into a more policy or interdisciplinary shaped agenda. So now you are more or less an ambassador for this transformative and inclusive climate science. Are your students currently miseducated if we teach them only physics? And what would you recommend someone today to tackle interdisciplinary problems? So it's a trade-off between specialization and generalist.
Well, I think we should not be satisfied with a trade-off. I think you need both, and you need both with deep roots. So I'm a stern defender of disciplinary foundation because that is one of the elements of a rational discussion, even in an interdisciplinary project or in an interdisciplinary task. So the disciplinary basis is basically the starting point, the jumping board from which young people then engage in reasonable and rational interdisciplinary activity. But the seed needs to be placed at an early stage in order to avoid that people grow up in their higher education institution with a uniquely disciplinary viewpoint.
So if we assume we cannot accelerate education, you need to run first a disciplinary study to be an expert in something, and then develop to something, to someone who is more interdisciplinary. But that takes time. So it's at the length scale of a climate effect, right? You need 20, 30 years to be an expert in a disciplinary field and then move to an interdisciplinary field. How can we accelerate that?
I see the challenge, but think a little bit back. You could start earlier. you could start earlier at school, at ground and primary school, with interdisciplinary topics, with the topic of Earth system science, for example, where you teach important elements of how humans deal with the environment, how humans are positioned in the environment, how they manage the environment, and what mistakes have been made in the past in living in the environment and with the environment. If you start early, I think that plants the seed that I just mentioned in education.
So this is strongly advocating for specialized primary school and high school education.
I'm not a fan of specialization, because specialization in that sense at that early stage already means privileges and deprivileges. What we need to absolutely avoid is multi-classes where the children are segregated already at an early stage into those that do science and others that do other things. So I firmly believe in a comprehensive and credible education that also is encompassing all the aspects that we need to have mature individuals that then come to the university and carry out research and then perhaps open up their perspective into interdisciplinary questions.
So in the IPCC, a very bold and interesting move was made to include, for example, experts on sustainable finance. At the end, my personal hope is that we can translate a climate effect to a financial effect and then attribute it regionally to a particular geographic location. So whose responsibility is it actually that all these different disciplines, the physics of the climate system, the mechanisms of the financial system, the spatial attribution of the geographic system, talk to each other? Who should moderate this discussion?
It's a joint responsibility of the policymakers who request that encompassing view, but also at the same time a responsibility of the scientists, that they are used to such a discussion, that they can carry out a meaningful discourse across the disciplines. The topics that you mentioned, finance, but I could also equally mention law or ethics or economy. All these topics have an important bearing on facing and confronting the climate challenge. And if the scientists are able to talk together and come up with a consensus, such a consensus, in my experience, is very difficult to be challenged by lobbying groups and by policymakers who have an agenda.
So you advocate strongly also that there is a human contribution to the CO2 raise in the Earth system. Who owns actually the climate system? If there is a very strong anthropogenic contribution, we actually have to answer the question of ownership.
I think rather than asking the question of ownership, I would ask the question of responsibility. The ownership I can see only in future generations. And it's not an ownership, it's a stewardship. So you are not the owner of the environment, but you are the steward of the environment and the resources on this planet for a finite amount of time. Our generation has been the steward of this planet for the last 30 years and the next 10 years perhaps, but the generations are already in place. And some of them are in the movement of the Fridays for Future, who think about the stewardship of this planet in the next 20 to 50 years.
So if we would invite you for a thought experiment and we would just assume there is no anthropogenic component in, let's say, the rise of the greenhouse gases or CO2, we would not need Paris or the Paris Accord, right? Because it would not be a national problem. But would we still take measures to make sure we can somehow minimize the CO2 output of the anthropogenic activities?
Absolutely. I think it's long been known that the risks are very high of a disruptive climate system and ecosystems that are no longer able to render the services that we are used to and that for most of human history we have been unaware of. We only now appreciate how much we depend on nature and its services, and so I think this will be a very high priority even in the absence of large national emissions.
So let's move a little bit on and talk about a topic that has become to the core of your heart, sustainability, or what we call the fourth megatrend following industrialization, globalization and digitalization. It is sustainabilization. Now, which commercial sector or which academic group will coin sustainabilization? If we look at the other three megatrends, industrialization, we think about the Ford Motor Company. For globalization, we think about the global food distribution chains like Nestle or similar ones, and digitalization would be Google. So who would be the analog of sustainabilization in your view?
That's a very difficult question, but I believe it won't be a single powerful company. It's going to be everybody of us, and foremost those people who live in privileged industrialized countries. They have to move forward. They have to show the way how a modern life can be carried onwards in a very different way with regards to the resources that are available to us on this planet. These resources are limited. Unlimited growth, that is the paradigm of many sciences, will no longer be possible. In fact, circular economy will be the only way out of this crisis that we are maneuvering ourselves into. And in achieving that, I don't believe that this will be one powerful company, but it will be a ground-based movement that involves everybody. It will involve also democratically chosen governments that represent that new will to actually move towards sustainability and giving us the boundary conditions with which development is possible.
You're not mentioning the International Panel on Climate Change, but I know that the University of Bern has recently co-founded the International Universities Climate Alliance. Is this the way you're going to push sustainabilization? Is it the aim, or can we think about IPCC version 2.0 who will take that role in the future?
Well, the IPCC, if you really look at the charter of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, we're not an organization that has any power. It's actually just a service to society and policymakers to put on the table the consensus view, the robust science, and particularly in this current corona crisis, we all appreciate the value of facts. We all appreciate the value of robust science, and that is what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has been doing in the spirit of empowering the policymakers to actually take the decision. In the last 15 years, IPCC has also empowered people by more directly and more simply speaking to the public and providing them direct access to sometimes very complex scientific facts and results. Take the example of the Fridays for Future movement. These young people have perfectly well understood the major messages of the last assessment report IPCC has published.
So at the end, it boils down to convert national individual states to accept sustainability also as a key point on their agenda. So how do national governments transform themselves towards sustainability?
I think there are two components that need to come together. First of all, an appreciation that sustainability is not something new. Old societies have very well known what sustainability is. In fact, they had many mechanisms to actually live sustainability. But here we are looking back at societies 200, 300 years ago. Indigenous societies know very well what sustainability is. At the same time, we need the forward-looking perspective, where we appreciate that we need new products, new processes that help us live a modern life in sustainability. For example, recycling. For example, smart products. For example, virtual meetings that have a much smaller carbon footprint than traveling far distances to meet people.
Thomas, I was always wondering about carbon footprint. The discussion we usually have is very much focused on air travel. I hypothesize our carbon footprint of using mobile phones is way bigger than any air travel we do. What's your opinion about that?
That's again very provocative. It certainly depends how often you use the mobile phone, how often you actually change your mobile phone. But let's face it, air travel in the global view of emissions is not yet a dominant factor. But in the industrialized countries, it is a significant part of our daily footprint. In Switzerland, it's almost 20% of every individual's footprint goes to air travel. It's usually air travel that is associated with leisure activities, vacation, etc., but also professional. And it's a sector that is tremendously increasing year by year. And it's also a sector that uses a technology which I think challenges every engineer on this planet to make it more sustainable.
As a geographer, I have to ask this question about the mobile phones simply because the use of a mobile phone implies a lot of different natural resources that are used to build a mobile phone. In particular, rare earth material is rare on Earth, and it has sometimes the flavor of being gained by land grabbing activities. So commercial companies try to exploit the land. So the footprint mobile phones generate on assembling their natural resources to be produced is way bigger than in the aircraft industry.
I would absolutely agree with you, but you are referring to a sustainability footprint, which is much more comprehensive than just a carbon footprint. You were talking about land grabbing, you were talking about social distress in countries associated with resources, and I absolutely agree with that. In fact, the mobile phone is actually a nice example of a gadget that needs to enter a circular economy paradigm. In other words, we have to come up with clever processes to give value to the mobile phone you today decide to get rid of. Waste is no longer waste. Waste must become valuable, and as soon as society assigns a value to what is today waste, there will be processes and business models that create jobs, that create value chains after what is today waste. And that's precisely what we should do with a mobile phone. I sometimes hypothesize that a heap of mobile phones has a higher concentration of all interesting minerals than any mine somewhere distant from here, Switzerland.
I love this footprint story because it puts forward a requirement to develop a holistic model. A climate model, you pointed it out properly, is very good to describe the climate. But in order to describe a holistic system, we need Earth system models, including the humans as actors. Whose responsibility do you think should it be to develop these models? And I'm not talking about the physical development of the model itself, but in IPCC, the convergence of the climate models, the evolution in the climate models, I think is the biggest achievement. People subscribe and say, I want to be in that competition to demonstrate how we can progress. So who should take the responsibility for Earth system models or holistic Earth models?
I think the success in science has always come from individuals, from people who had an idea, from scientists who had a vision, who wanted to push forward. And I think we are looking at the new generation of scientists who are well aware of the potential at these boundaries between the disciplines for example, between the physical climate science and the finance sector, or the physical climate science and biology when you talk about ecosystem services. At these boundaries, we will have the emergence of new insight, new science, and ultimately, I firmly believe, also new models that will be created to help us assess risks for future development. So I think it's the responsibility of the scientists, and our responsibility today, I would argue, is to motivate that development in the scientific community.
So in a recent IPCC finding, it was put forward that land use and land cover change is one of the key drivers of the Earth system. So shouldn't we integrate human-based land cover change much better in the climate models in order to get a better handle on predicting what is going to happen on the Earth's surface?
I fully agree with you. Give us the budget to do that. It's a very complex science because it's very heterogeneous. So we really have to know the character of the soils around the globe. We have to understand the biological and ecosystem processes. And then also for the physical science, this is a big challenge because we need to be able to assess and project precipitation and water cycle changes in the future to a much higher accuracy than is possible today.
So to your opinion, what is driving the change more, the climate change or the land surface change? Has land surface or land cover, land use change become the driver of the climate system?
I see it more combined and more granular, if you wish. For regional climate change, land use is absolutely crucial. But without the global emissions of carbon dioxide, we wouldn't have the big climate crisis that we are in right now. Currently, land use change in terms of greenhouse gas emissions is responsible for about 10% of the emissions. If you take the production of food into that equation, then it's another 25%. But that is not only land use and land use change, but it is also the entire production chain of creating food for people.
So, switching the topic and looking a little bit into the future, I think it's one of our biggest responsibilities is to define the future of progress. Now, the post-Second World War generation has probably a different definition of what is progress than probably our children will have. So Steven Pinker recently wrote in his book Enlightenment Now that if we rely on data, we will be better appreciating the progress that gives us the courage and conviction to try to strive for more progress. What would you say is the most important progress we have to achieve in the future?
Well, I would agree that without data, we will have no progress. That's absolutely clear that we need data. But we also need an attitude and we need a morale for the future. And without the appreciation, for example, what a resource to us means, without the appreciation what an ecosystem and its services mean to us, without an appreciation of biodiversity and its value, we will be not making a lot of progress. In fact, there will be more crises just down the road.
So coming back to the future and the role model, Switzerland is globally known for its humanitarian tradition. The Red Cross headquarters is located in Geneva. We had Jakob Kellenberger, a very famous person serving as president for the International Committee of the Red Cross, fostering that tradition. In addition to that, Switzerland is known for its diplomatic tradition. In particular, we are representing the United States and their interest in Iran, for example. So what would be needed to develop what we would call a climate tradition, the tradition to negotiate climate-relevant parts in the world? Do you think Switzerland can take this role?
That's an interesting proposal. I think it needs much more than being a good negotiator or a role model in climate negotiations. I think Switzerland is in the unique position to actually show that a rich country that is fully industrialized and looks at a great educational basis to be a role model for sustainabilization. And that encompasses much more than policy maker dialogues, agreements at the UN level, etc., etc. It means that we think further how we can actually organize our society on the one hand with innovative tax reforms that actually help us make that transition to sustainabilization. So that's something that we can do locally on the political democratic level, but at the same time making use of our excellent innovation basis that we have in Switzerland to produce the technology that we need for sustainabilization.
That is very interesting, Thomas. Are you volunteering to take leadership on that topic?
I don't know what position that would entail.
So finally, I would be interested in hearing from you. We also need individual transformation. So individual behavior is driving finally a community behavior and a national behavior. What role and responsibility do you think should we take as universities in the future to foster individual transformation aiming at more sustainability?
I think in my keynote I laid out a few possibilities. Education is a key incubator for sustainabilization. Education needs to be comprehensive, it needs to be credible, and it needs to be competent in the sense that we actually show that the science is taking into account all the different aspects. I also argued that the generation of students that are engaging in the natural sciences are exposed to the values and the thought processes from the social and human sciences in order to better understand, for example, decision processes. But at the same time, I also call for lawyers and economists to actually study, to some extent, scientific facts and the scientific essence of sustainability. I think we are well advised if we have educated decision makers that have a basic understanding of sustainability.
So coming back to the topic of your talk, you said, have science and education failed properly putting climate change on the agenda? What would be your final conclusion on that?
Well, in science we have made important steps. I think we have brought the facts to the table, to the people, to the policymakers. The facts are there, the data are there. In education we still have a long way to go, but that doesn't mean that in science we shall stop. Science needs to push forward, science needs to become more comprehensive. As you mentioned, I can envisage models that incorporate the value of an ecosystem when it comes to projecting the future of this planet, the future of some metrics of a country, for example. Things like that interdisciplinarily look at the problem in a comprehensive manner and provide us with the arguments and the point to actually convince not only policymakers, but also those who elect them.
Thomas, we have discussed a lot about climate change and sustainability. I much appreciate your advocating the combination of both. Before we end this expert talk, I would like to offer you a closing remark.
Well, first of all, I appreciate that the University of Zurich takes this opportunity to host this conference and give us the opportunity to have this discussion on this probably what is the most important topic determining humans' future. It's climate change and sustainability, and I think if the University of Bern, my university, and your university, University of Zurich, Switzerland as a whole, and the academic world around the planet can make a contribution, that would be extremely valuable.
Thomas, I would like to thank you very much on behalf of all University 21 members and our audience for your very inspiring keynote talk and the subsequent expert talk between us. I very much appreciate your insightful answers to very important issues arising from the global climate and devoting your career to climate. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michi. Thank you.